Good afternoon. It's Thursday, April 16th, about 4:30 Miami time, and I'm speaking with Mabel Wilson. Mabel, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to speak with me today.
Real pleasure.
Mabel, I was wondering if you could tell us exactly where you are and how the recent events surrounding this COVID-19 virus have affected the structure of your life and your work, if any.
Sure. I am in New York City in a high-rise apartment building on Riverside Drive. So I'm in Upper Manhattan because I teach at Columbia University. I am technically in what's called university housing. And so I've been in my apartment, which is one bedroom. And I primarily have been working from my dining table that has absolutely lovely view of Riverside Park and actually the Hudson River and New Jersey, the other side. And so for me, I mean, the thing that's changed is, the ability to basically go to campus, work in my office, meet with students, and travel to do talks and projects that I've been working on. I'm working on an exhibition. All of that got canceled, plenaries, keynotes. So it was very interesting to see your calendar just basically get wiped clean. And then really what was remaining were your teaching duties. So I've basically been home, teaching on Zoom, and then, working on different writing projects, building projects that I have going on. But that's what I was doing anyway, which was, a lot of my meetings on one project were Zoom because the key firms in Boston, the clients in Virginia. So in some respects, things changed. In other ways, this is, working from a computer, being online, it hasn't impacted my work that much.
I'm curious, since many who are participating in the interview are educators, I'm curious to hear your experience with the transition to online. Has it been smooth, or maybe what kinds of courses are you currently conducting?
Yeah, I am teaching 2 seminars, one in architecture, a PhD colloquium. That's on property, which has been quite fascinating to think about the theoretical, really epistemological, ontological questions around like property in the West as a formation, but it's also dealing with questions of dispossession and displacement. And then the other class is actually not in architecture, but African American and African diasporic studies that I'm co-teaching with a colleague, Saidia Hartman. And that's on enclosures, looking at racialized enclosures and the ways in which they operate as forms of dominance and white supremacy. And that's also been quite interesting. And, I think those 2 classes and thinking about what's going on globally have been very relevant because it's been, oddly enough, quite easy to fold in current events into those conversations for those classes. I'm not teaching studio, so I have not had to adjust with teaching a design process online. So, the way in which you teach seminars and conversations and discussions work, I think, okay with Zoom. But, there's also just being mindful that, we are, as opposed to the university being the site in which we convene and the institutional structure, that essentially frame our disciplining. We are now atomized. We're in homes all over the place. And with that, people are dealing with family members who've been sick, roommates, financial uncertainty. And that's very real. And to think about how does one teach, what does one teach, what are the pressures that we place on students in that context have been, I think, very sobering.
Indeed. So maybe this is a good transition into the second question, which, and I know it's early, but since we've been sort of in our own homes for the last couple of weeks, I was wondering if you had any opinions about what impacts these recent events may have on the world of architecture or architectural education even, or maybe more broadly on the future design of cities.
I've been thinking a lot about the discipline of architecture and its origins in the West. And it both as a discipline in discourse, its professionalization, the development of its educational program, like all of the, and that's by the latter part of the 19th century, which is the structure we've essentially inherited around practice and education and professional. And that model has actually now become a global model, right, for the education of people who are building. But and also now we have a global building industry, like the work I do with Who Builds Your Architecture really takes that on. But there were other ways of building, like without drawings and ways of building in the world that weren't architecture. And so I've been thinking about the particularities of architecture and its Western formation, particularly in its relationship to capitalism, and also ideas of racial difference, which sort of helps understand like how do we get a world that is segregated and unequal. And I think you can look at the current pandemic and see how this plays out, why large numbers of Black and brown people are those people who are hit the hardest, because they have poor housing, poor access to healthcare. They're the frontline workers. They're the ones who have to ride, in this city, ride mass transit. And this isn't a fault of their own or their families, but these are the legacies of the constant dispossession, disenfranchisement, and exploitation of what I think it's Eric Williams calls racial capitalism. And so that has produced a world, I think, that is fundamentally unequal and, quite frankly, as we now know from the planet, unsustainable. So for me, the profound question that I have, not just for architects, but for humans, like, what is it that we need to do so that humans survive and that also we leave a planet for all the other species that we currently live with to survive? And what is our fundamental humanness that we could start to build an environment for that ensures that we have clean water, ensures that the air is not polluted, ensures, that we have schools where people can learn, all of the things that modern society is supposed to provide us. But clearly we could see in the United States that our healthcare system is completely inadequate. It's run on the logics of scarcity and rationing. And therefore, people don't have access. And it's also run through a system where you get your healthcare by through work. So now we have a bunch of people that 22 million, I think, as of today, who are unemployed, but those are probably 22 million people who now no longer have healthcare. So to think about how we might build a world, what does that mean for designing hospitals? That might be for, let's say, a universal healthcare system. How do we think about building cities that, might be more ecologically sound, pollute less, but does everything have to be privatized? Like, what is the role of the state in building? Can the so-called private sector, which has grown more and more to be the employer, I think, of architects, should we have other ways of engaging building practices in terms of our clients?
Yeah, I think you bring up many excellent points, and you give voice to, I think, a community that oftentimes doesn't have a voice, but we've certainly seen in much of the recent articles where these communities are being affected at much higher rates for the reasons that you mentioned earlier. And I think you pointed to a number of interrelated forces. You're talking about kind of regulatory frameworks, right, as well as healthcare systems, which are probably outside of the realm of architecture, but are intrinsically linked to the policies that give rise to the work that architects do. So do you see, when we exit this, which we eventually will, do you have thoughts about how, as writers and researchers and architects and urbanists, we might play a role in that conversation, or we might have a role in that conversation? I say that because oftentimes design tends to come after the changes in regulatory frameworks, which are sort of outside of the control of the architect? Or do you believe that's true? Do you believe we can have more of an
I
influence?
think that that's true and not true, because I think when, now that we live under a capitalist system that has basically intertwined all of these relationships, right? That we are all engaged in how we shop and where we work, and very, very, very complex systems that actually there is agency within the system. Like, we just stopped shopping, we stopped buying, we stopped going. We radically changed a global system of capitalism, right? And what's next? Do we have to go back to that system? Are there other ways in which the system can operate more equitably? And that's the question, because what the system does, it rewards those who can scam the system, who could basically profit from it, right? I mean, that's what capitalism is. You've got to be able to extract surplus value from something in order to profit. And clearly, with the digital turn, with globalization and neoliberalism, it's allowed for the mass accrual of wealth in the hands of a very small people. And as we can see, there's a large billion global population that don't have homes, that don't have clean water, that don't have access to schools, that don't have the basics. And I always thought there was going to be something that was going to pressure the system to do a recalibration. And quite frankly, I always thought it was World War III. But I would have never suspected it would have been something like a virus that would do that, to remind us that it doesn't matter, we're all human, we're born and we die. We are all part of the human species, but these structures determine the quality of what it means to live. And architecture is a big part of it, because it builds the material realm in which we live. And to think about then, what does that mean within that system, to try to make it more equitable so that people's lives can be sustained as opposed to diminished. And that's what we're seeing, is that it's hitting those people whose lives were already diminished, right? And not just by having a pre-existing condition, but having a life where if you're sick, you can't get to healthcare. Again, the environmental stressors on people's bodies, have produced conditions where coronavirus hits those Black and brown communities the hardest.
Yeah, I think you remind us that a crisis gives us the opportunity to, if we use it well, to rethink the way in which we live and our role within it. So I'm hoping that this time of, let's say, confinement or social distancing will allow us to focus on some of these really important issues that you raise. And I'm grateful for you having taken the time to spend a few minutes talking about them. So thanks again, and I hope that you remain safe and well. And I look forward to a continued conversation once we can all reconnect in the physical world.
Yeah, great. Thank you.